In the spring of 2012, in the hills just outside Redfern, West Virginia, Caleb Mercer stood alone in the cracked parking lot of the Willow Creek Motel and wondered if grief could sound like silence. The place had been closed longer than he'd been alive. The brick was darkened with age and rain. Paint peeled from the wooden beams that held up the sagging awning. Weeds pushed through the asphalt in long, stubborn lines. A rusted sign on two metal poles leaned slightly forward. The word motel faded to a dull orange, like it had been sunburned decades ago and never healed. One door stood open. Not wide. Just enough. A strip of yellow light spilled out onto the concrete, even though there was no power running to the building. Caleb noticed that first, and it made his stomach tighten. He hadn't planned on stopping. He'd driven 3 hours from Charleston with the windows down, the radio off, and the folded deeds sitting on the passenger seat like something that didn't belong to him. He told himself he would walk the property, lock the doors, call a realtor, and be done with it. Sell the land. Pay off what little debt his father had left behind. Close the chapter. That was the sensible thing. Everyone had told him so. His sister had laughed when the lawyer read the will. The motel? She'd said. What motel? An uncle had shaken his head. That place is a sinkhole. Been rotting since the 90s. Even the attorney, careful and polite, had raised an eyebrow. Most people would refuse this, he said. You're sure? Caleb had nodded then. He wasn't sure now. The wind moved through the bare trees behind the building, carrying the smell of damp leaves and old earth. It was late March, but winter hadn't quite let go of the hills yet. The air still had teeth. Gray clouds hung low, heavy with the promise of another cold snap. Extreme weather had become common here. Harder winters. Longer freezes. Power outages that lasted days. Sometimes weeks. Caleb worked construction. He'd seen what happened when people underestimated the cold. He took a few steps forward, boots crunching on gravel and broken glass. The parking spaces were still faintly visible, white lines ghosted into the pavement. He counted the doors as he walked, like he used to as a kid when his father brought him here for reasons he never explained. 1, 2, 3. The windows were dark. One had a spiderweb cracked clean across it, the glass still holding, like it refused to fall apart. 4. Then the open door. It wasn't forced. The hinges weren't broken. The lock wasn't damaged. It was just open. Caleb stopped several feet away. Room numbers were nailed above each door. Old metal plates, chipped and crooked. He saw 201, then 202, then 204. There was number 203. The open door had no number at all. He told himself it was nothing. A missing plate. Vandals. Kids from town. But something about the way the door stood there, quiet and patient, made him feel like the building had been waiting. Caleb had inherited more than a property. He'd inherited questions no one wanted to answer. His father, Robert Mercer, had died 6 months earlier. Heart attack. Quick, the doctor said. Merciful. Caleb wasn't sure about that. His father had been a quiet man, the kind who fixed things without explaining how and carried his regrets like tools he never set down. They hadn't talked much about the motel. When Caleb was 10, he'd asked why they never stayed there. His father had looked past him, out the kitchen window, and said, "Some places are better left closed." That was the end of it. Caleb reached the door and stood just outside the threshold. The smell hit him first. Cold air mixed with dust and old fabric. No rot. No mold. Just age. The room was small. A single bed with a thin mattress. An iron frame bolted into the floor. A desk by the window. A chair pulled back like someone had just stood up. The walls were painted a pale green that had faded unevenly. The curtains were half drawn. The light inside wasn't electric. It came from the window, filtered through cloud cover and bare branches. Caleb didn't step in. He looked at the bed. The sheets were tucked tight. No dust. No footprints. Someone had kept this room sealed. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He jumped slightly, then pulled it out. A text from his sister. "You there yet? Don't stay long. That place gives me the creeps." He typed back with one hand. "Just checking it out." She replied almost instantly. "Caleb, don't get ideas. Sell it. Take the money. Walk away." He put the phone away without answering. He stepped into the room. The floorboards didn't creak. They were solid. Too solid for a building everyone said was falling apart. He walked to the desk. A single object sat in the center. A guest ledger, closed, its cover cracked but intact. He didn't open it yet. Instead, he noticed something else. The air was warmer in here. Not much. Maybe 10 degrees. But enough that he felt it on his face, on his hands. Enough that the hairs on his arms rose. There was no heater. No vent. No wiring. Caleb stood still, listening. The motel around him was silent. No animals in the walls. No wind through broken panes. The room felt tilt. He left after 10 minutes. Locked the door behind him. Or tried to. The key turned easily, but the latch didn't catch. The door stayed slightly open, exactly as it had been before. Caleb drove into town and stopped at a diner that still used handwritten menus and served coffee strong enough to hurt. He sat at the counter, staring into his mug, and asked the woman pouring refills if she remembered the Willow Creek Motel. Her hand froze. She didn't look at him right away. "Why you asking about that place?" she said. "I inherited it," Caleb replied. That got her attention. She studied him, then sighed. "Your dad's boy." He nodded. She leaned closer, voice lower. "You should sell it. That's what everyone says." "There's a reason for that." "What reason?" She shook her head. "Things happened out there." "What kind of things?" She straightened, poured coffee for another customer, and said nothing more. Outside, 2 men loading supplies into a pickup overheard the exchange. One laughed. "You thinking of fixing that dump up?" Caleb hesitated. "I'm thinking of staying." The laughter stopped. "Staying?" the other man said. "In winter?" "I've seen worse," Caleb replied. They exchanged looks. "Power goes out every year," the first man said. "Sometimes for days." "I know. No heat. No water. That building's not insulated." Caleb thought of the warmth in that room. "Still," he said. The second man shook his head. "That's a stupid way to die." That night, back at the motel, Caleb sat in his truck with the engine off, headlights dark, watching the building disappear into the trees. The forecast on his phone warned of an incoming cold front. Temperatures dropping into the teens. Possible snow. High winds. He thought about his father. About unanswered questions. About the room that stayed warm without explanation. He could leave. Everyone expected him to. Instead, Caleb made a decision that would change everything. He unloaded his tools from the truck. Carried in a sleeping bag. A lantern. A notebook. He chose the open door. Room without a number. Room no one talked about. As the temperature dropped and the wind began to rise, Caleb Mercer closed the door behind him, unaware that by choosing to stay, he was stepping into a story that had been waiting decades for someone to finish it. Caleb woke before dawn with the uneasy feeling that comes when a place hasn't decided whether it wants you there. The room was dim and quiet. Gray light pressed against the curtains, flat and cold. The sleeping bag was zipped tight around his shoulders, but he wasn't cold. That registered slowly, like a delayed thought. The air held steady, not warm, not frigid. Comfortable enough that he hadn't woken shivering. He sat up and listened. Nothing. No hum of electricity. No heater kicking on. No pipes ticking or wind pushing through gaps in the walls. Just stillness. Thick and deliberate. Caleb rubbed his hands together and exhaled. His breath didn't fog. That shouldn't have been possible. Outside, frost coated the gravel. He could see it through the narrow gap in the curtains. The temperature had dropped into the low 20s overnight. His phone, which he'd left on the desk, confirmed it. 21 degrees at 5:46 a.m. He swung his legs off the bed and stood. The floor was cold beneath his socks, but not shockingly so. He crossed the room, opened the door, and stepped into the narrow walkway that ran along the front of the motel. The difference hit him immediately. Cold snapped against his face. The kind that burned the inside of your nose. The kind that reminded you how fragile heat really was. He stepped back inside and closed the door. The room settled again, like a held breath released. Caleb leaned against the wall and laughed quietly, not because anything was funny, but because he didn't know what else to do. He had a choice. He could ignore it, walk away, chalk it up to insulation quirks or old construction tricks he didn't understand yet. Or he could stay and find out. By mid-morning, the sky darkened. Wind picked up, rattling loose trim and bending the tops of the trees. Caleb stood outside with his jacket zipped to his chin, studying the building like it was a patient with symptoms no one could explain. He took notes in the small notebook he brought. Room holds heat overnight. No visible heat source. Door will not latch fully. Rest of building unlivable. He tried other rooms. Room 201 was dead cold. His breath clouded instantly. The window frame rattled when the wind gusted. Room 202 smelled damp and metallic. The floor sagged near the bathroom. The ceiling showed water damage that had never been repaired. Room 204 had no mattress. Just an empty frame and broken blinds. None of them felt like the room without a number. Caleb went back inside it and shut the door. He sat at the desk and rested his hands on the wood. His father had sat here once. Maybe more than once. Caleb had memories of riding in the truck as a kid, sitting quietly while his father stopped at the motel to check something. He'd never been invited inside. Now he understood why. The room wasn't magical. He didn't believe in that. But it was intentional. Someone had built it differently. That realization carried weight. Caleb's phone rang. His sister. He answered this time. "You didn't leave," she said. "Not a question. I stayed the night." There was a pause. "Why?" "I think there's something wrong with the place." She exhaled sharply. "Wrong like unsafe? Wrong like unfinished. That's not comforting. Neither is pretending it doesn't matter." She lowered her voice. "Caleb, Dad avoided that place his whole life. Whatever happened there messed him up. That's exactly why I'm here. You can't fix the past." "No," he said. "But I can understand it." She was quiet for a long moment. "You always did this," she said finally. "Ran toward problems instead of away from them. Someone has to. Just promise me you'll leave if it gets dangerous." Caleb looked at the window. At the gray sky pressing down on the hills. At the forecast that now showed snow starting by nightfall. "I'll be careful," he said. He hung up and sat in the silence. By afternoon, the wind turned sharp. Snow started as a fine mist, then thickened into flakes that stuck to the ground. Caleb dragged an old metal chair from one of the storage rooms and wedged it under the door handle. The latch still wouldn't catch, but the door stayed closed now. He cooked a simple meal on a camp stove in the parking lot. Beans. Bread. He ate standing up, collar turned high, watching the snow accumulate. No cars passed. No one came looking. The motel felt cut off from the rest of the world, like it existed on its own rules. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped again. Caleb retreated to the room and lit the lantern. Shadows climbed the walls, stretching long and thin. He opened the guest ledger at last. Most of the pages were blank. The last entry was dated October 1994. No name. Just a signature line left empty. Below it, in smaller handwriting, someone had written a single sentence. "Room sealed. Do not assign." Caleb traced the words with his finger. He thought about his father's hands. Steady. The kind that didn't shake, even when something inside him probably did. Why seal a room instead of tearing it out? Why leave it standing? The snow came harder after midnight. Caleb woke to the sound of wind howling through the trees. The building creaked and shifted, but the room stayed still. He checked his phone. No signal now. Power lines somewhere had gone down. He sat on the bed and waited. Hours passed. The lantern dimmed slightly. He adjusted it, then set it down and lay back, staring at the ceiling. He thought about money. About the construction jobs drying up every winter. About the small loan he'd taken to keep his truck running. About how close he'd come, more than once, to packing up and leaving the state entirely. He thought about his father, sitting at their kitchen table late at night, hands wrapped around a mug he never drank from. "You ever wish you'd done things differently?" Caleb had asked him once. His father had smiled, thin and tired. "Every day." "What stopped you?" His father had looked down. "Fear." Caleb understood that now. The storm lasted 2 days. Snow piled against the doors. The road out disappeared under white drifts. Caleb rationed his food. He checked the temperature inside the room every few hours. It stayed steady. Low 60s. Never higher. Never lower. The rest of the motel froze solid. On the third morning, Caleb woke to a sound that didn't belong. An engine. He stood and pulled the curtain back an inch. A truck crawled into the lot, tires crunching through ice. Two men stepped out, bundled tight, faces red from the cold. One slipped and caught himself on a railing. They stared at the building. Then they stared at the light coming from Caleb's window. Caleb opened the door. Steam rolled out into the freezing air. The men froze. "What the hell?" one of them said. "You live here?" the other asked. "For now," Caleb replied. They stepped closer, disbelief plain on their faces. "There's no power," one said. "I know." "No generator?" "No heater." They looked at each other. "That's not possible." Caleb stepped aside and let them look inside. The room didn't glow. It didn't feel miraculous. It just felt livable. The first man shook his head slowly. "You're gonna get yourself killed doing this." Caleb met his eyes. "Or I'm going to learn something everyone else was too afraid to face." The wind cut between them. Snow drifted across the lot. Caleb stood his ground. Because now it wasn't just curiosity. It was proof. And whatever this room was meant to do, whatever his father had protected by sealing it away, walking out now would mean losing something he might never get back. So he stayed. And the cold, relentless and honest, kept testing him. Caleb didn't sleep much after the men left. Not because he was afraid, but because his mind wouldn't slow down. The room was no longer just a shelter. It was evidence. By morning, the storm had moved east, leaving the hills buried and quiet. Snow hung from the edges of the roof like broken teeth. The motel looked even more abandoned now, swallowed by white and shadow. The road was still impassable. No plows came this far out unless someone called. And no one had. Caleb brewed instant coffee on the camp stove just inside the doorway, watching steam curl upward. He took a sip and grimaced. Bitter. Thin. But hot. He opened his notebook and started a new page. If this works, it was built this way on purpose. He began examining the room methodically, the way he would a job site. Walls first. He pressed his palm flat against the drywall. It felt thicker than standard. Not much. Maybe an inch or two. But enough to matter. He knocked gently with his knuckles. The sound was dull, muted. Insulation. Old insulation, judging by the smell when he pulled back a loose outlet cover. Not fiberglass. Something denser. He remembered his father once mentioning packed cellulose during a late-night repair at home. Newspaper pulp. Effective. Heavy. The ceiling showed the same signs. Lower than the other rooms. Slightly. Caleb grabbed a tape measure from his bag and checked. The room was 6 inches shorter than 201 next door. Someone had sacrificed headroom to trap heat. He crouched near the floor and ran his hand along the baseboards. No drafts. No gaps. The seams were tight, sealed with something that had yellowed with age. But his chest tightened. This wasn't a shortcut. It wasn't a fluke. This was deliberate craftsmanship. He pulled the bed frame away from the wall and knelt, shining his flashlight behind it. There, hidden in the shadows, was a vent cut low into the brick. Not open to the outside. It angled downward, then disappeared into the ground. Caleb swore under his breath. Earth coupling. He'd seen something like it once in a trade magazine. A way to stabilize indoor temperatures by running air through underground channels, using the constant temperature of the soil. Not common. Not cheap. Not easy. Definitely not something you built by accident. He went outside and dug through the snow with a shovel he found in the maintenance shed. The ground beneath was hard but workable. He followed the rough line of the vent until he uncovered a capped pipe, rusted but intact, running away from the motel and down the slope toward the trees. Whoever built this had known what they were doing. Caleb stood there, breath fogging, heart pounding harder than the cold demanded. His father had worked construction most of his life. Framing. Foundations. Practical things. But this was different. This was careful. Quiet. Hidden. Why hide it? He went back inside and sat on the bed, elbows on his knees. Because people talk. Because inspectors ask questions. Because sometimes the safest thing to do with something powerful is pretend it doesn't exist. By noon, the men from the truck returned, this time with a third person. A woman in her 40s, bundled in a heavy coat, carrying a clipboard like a shield. County Inspector. Caleb recognized the look. Cautious curiosity mixed with professional doubt. "You're the one staying here," she said. "That's right." "There's no active permit for this property," she said. "No utilities." "I know." She raised an eyebrow. "Then explain the heat." "I'm trying to," Caleb said. "That's why I'm still here." She hesitated, then stepped inside the room. Her shoulders dropped almost immediately. She didn't smile. She didn't gasp. She just stood still and felt the air. "This shouldn't be possible," she said quietly. Caleb showed her the walls. The ceiling. The vent. She crouched, frowned, took notes. "This is old," she said. "90s, maybe earlier. My father owned the place." She looked up at him. "Then your father was smarter than people gave him credit for." The men hovered near the door. "You planning to fix the whole place like this?" one asked. Caleb shook his head. "I can't. Not yet." The inspector closed her clipboard. "You shouldn't be here in winter. Not legally. Not safely." "I'm not asking permission," Caleb said. "I'm asking questions." She studied him for a long moment. "Just don't invite anyone else," she said finally. "If someone gets hurt, this turns ugly fast." "I understand." After they left, Caleb didn't feel victorious. He felt responsible. Because now he knew. And knowing meant deciding what to do with it. That afternoon, he began working. Quietly. He didn't try to heat the whole motel. He focused on understanding the system. He traced the underground pipe as far as he could without digging up half the hillside. He checked airflow using smoke from a blown-out match. Slow, steady, controlled. He sealed a crack near the window with wax from an old candle he found in storage. Patched another seam with insulation salvaged from a ruined room. As he worked, memory surfaced. His father fixing things late at night. Refusing help. Never explaining. Not because he didn't care. Because he didn't want anyone else carrying the weight of it. By the third night, the cold returned. Harder this time. Temperatures dropped into the single digits. Wind screamed down the valley. The motel groaned under the strain. Caleb sat inside the room, jacket off, notebook open, lantern low. Temperature, 61 degrees. Outside, 7. He wrote it down. Then he waited. Because whatever this room was built to survive, whatever secret logic held it together, tonight would decide whether it was a clever idea or a fatal mistake. The wind slammed against the brick. Snow rattled the windows. Caleb didn't move. He just listened. And the room, steady and patient, listened with him. The storm arrived just after midnight, without ceremony. There was no gradual build-up. No gentle warning. One moment the wind was loud but manageable. The next, it roared like something alive, slamming into the hills with a force that made the motel shudder. Caleb was awake when it hit. He sat on the edge of the bed, boots on, jacket nearby, lantern turned low. The notebook rested open on the desk, pencil balanced across the page like a held breath. Outside temperature had dropped to 4 degrees by 11:30. By 12:15, it was already lower. The wind drove snow sideways, packing it into corners, under doors, into places that hadn't felt weather in decades. The old sign groaned on its bolts. Somewhere down the slope, a tree cracked and fell with a deep, hollow sound. Caleb stood and placed his hand flat against the wall. Still warm. Not hot. Not even comfortable in the way a furnace makes a room feel. It was the warmth of balance. Of something refusing to lose what it had. The lights in town went out just after 1 a.m. He knew because his phone buzzed weakly as the signal dropped, then disappeared altogether. The battery icon followed soon after, drained by cold and constant checking. Caleb shut the phone off and set it face down. He didn't need it now. The motel creaked around him. The sound wasn't panic. It was fatigue. Wood expanding and contracting under stress. Nails complaining. Old joints reminding each other they were still holding. He thought about the other rooms. About how thin their walls were. How exposed. How quickly the cold would claim them. Around 2 a.m., he heard shouting. It carried faintly through the wind, broken and sharp. Caleb grabbed his jacket and stepped outside. The cold hit him like a blow. His breath came hard and fast. Snow stung his cheeks. Visibility was less than 20 feet. A flashlight beam cut through the dark from the far end of the lot. "Hey!" someone shouted. "Over here!" Caleb ran, boots slipping on ice, heart pounding harder than the climb demanded. Two figures stood near room 201. One was bent over, hands on his knees. The other waved frantically. Their truck sat at an angle, half buried in drifted snow. "Won't start," the taller one yelled. "Battery's dead." The other man's face was pale. His lips had a blue edge. "How long you been out here?" Caleb asked. "Too long," the man said. His teeth chattered violently. He slipped. Hit his head. Caleb looked at the motel. Room 201's door was rimmed with ice. Snow had forced its way under the frame. There was no heat in there. Not anymore. "You can't stay here," Caleb said. "You'll freeze." "Where else can we go?" the man asked. Caleb didn't answer. He grabbed the injured man under the arm and helped him walk. Every step was slow. Careful. The wind fought them the entire way. They reached the unnumbered door. Caleb pushed it open. Warm air spilled out into the night, visible even in the chaos, like breath. The men stopped. "What is this?" one whispered. "Inside," Caleb said. "Now." They didn't argue. The injured man sagged onto the bed almost immediately. His shivering slowed within minutes. Color crept back into his face. The other man stood in the center of the room, hands out, like he couldn't quite believe what he was feeling. "There's no heater," he said. "I checked." "I know. This doesn't make sense." "Sit down," Caleb said. "It will in the morning." The storm worsened. By dawn, wind speeds topped 50 miles an hour. Snowdrifts swallowed the lower half of the motel doors. Trees leaned at dangerous angles. Somewhere in town, pipes burst. Emergency calls stacked up faster than anyone could answer. Caleb took turns staying awake. He checked the injured man's head. No bleeding. Just a nasty knock. He wrapped him in extra blankets from storage. The temperature inside the room dipped slightly. 58. Then held. Outside it was -3. By mid-morning, more people came. A couple from town who'd lost power and heat. An older man who lived alone up the road, his furnace dead. They didn't arrive all at once. They came staggered, driven by rumor and desperation. Caleb didn't advertise. The room did. Word spread the way it always does in emergencies. Through glances. Through half-finished sentences. Through people who said, "I don't know how, but..." By noon, 6 people sat quietly inside the room. No one spoke much. They listened to the wind. To the building holding. To the strange, steady warmth that refused to leave. Outside, the rest of the motel suffered. A section of roof over room 202 collapsed under the weight of snow. The window in 204 shattered inward. Ice crept along the walls like veins. Inside the unnumbered room, condensation formed lightly on the glass. That was all. The county inspector returned that afternoon, snow-packed and wide-eyed. She stood in the doorway and stared. "You have people in here," she said. "They didn't have anywhere else," Caleb replied. She stepped inside. Counted heads. Took a slow breath. "This is dangerous," she said. "And it's saving lives." She looked at Caleb. Really looked at him this time. "You know what this means," she said. He nodded. "Yeah. You can't hide this anymore." "I wasn't planning to." The storm lasted another 36 hours. By the time it broke, 3 people in town had been hospitalized for exposure. 2 homes were declared unlivable. Power crews worked around the clock. Everyone who stayed in the room walked out alive. When the wind finally died, the silence felt different than before. Not heavy. Respectful. Caleb stood outside, breath fogging, and looked at the motel. The unnumbered door was still standing. Still warm. And now it had witnesses. Whatever his father had built, whatever quiet line he'd crossed all those years ago, the test had come. And the room had passed. When the snow finally stopped falling, the hills didn't look peaceful. They looked stunned. White pressed down on everything. Trees bent under the weight. Fences disappeared. The road out of Redfern was still blocked, but people were already moving, digging, checking on one another. Smoke rose from chimneys where heat had returned. From others, nothing. Caleb stood in the parking lot of the motel with his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets, watching men from the county mark damaged structures with orange tape. The rest of the building looked worse than it had before the storm. Roof sections sagged. 2 windows were gone entirely. The sign had finally snapped free from one pole and now leaned at a sharper angle, like it had given up trying to stand straight. But the unnumbered room looked exactly the same. Intact. Quiet. People noticed. They didn't gather in a crowd. This wasn't that kind of town. But they lingered. They walked past slowly. They asked questions without asking them directly. How'd it hold? Still warm. Did you have fuel? Caleb answered honestly. No fuel. No power. No generator. That was when the looks changed. Skepticism gave way to calculation. By midday, the county inspector returned with 2 men from the state. One wore a heavy coat with a stitched badge. The other carried equipment Caleb recognized from job sites. Thermal cameras. Moisture meters. Measuring tools. They didn't smile. They didn't joke. They worked. Caleb stayed out of the way and watched as they scanned the walls, the ceiling, the floor. The thermal image bloomed on the small screen in bands of color. Blues and purples bled across most of the building. Then they aimed it at the unnumbered room. A steady, even band of green appeared. No hot spots. No leaks. No sudden drops. Internal temperature? The badge-wearing man asked. The inspector checked her notes. 59 degrees. Held within a 4-degree range for 72 hours. And outside? -4 at the lowest. The man nodded once. That's not luck, he said. They asked Caleb to show them everything. He showed them the vent, the pipe, the sealed seams, the lowered ceiling. The man with the equipment crouched near the wall and tapped gently. This wasn't cheap, he said. Even back then. My father didn't have much money, Caleb replied. The man stood. Then he spent what he had very carefully. They asked about permits, about records, about plans. Caleb told them the truth. There weren't any. The inspector sighed. That tracks. What do you mean? She looked at the room. If this had been submitted, someone would have shut it down. Too unconventional. Too many questions. So he hid it. Yes, she said. And by doing that he saved it. They left in the late afternoon, taking copies of Caleb's notes and measurements with them. They didn't promise anything. They didn't need to. By evening, the story had moved beyond Redfern. Not fast. Not dramatically. But steadily. A reporter from a regional paper called. Asked about the storm. About the motel. About the room that stayed warm when everything else failed. Caleb agreed to talk, but only once. He didn't dress it up. He didn't exaggerate. He told them what happened. He told them why he stayed. He told them about his father. The article ran 3 days later. No headlines screaming miracles. No buzzwords. Just facts. An abandoned motel. A sealed room. A winter storm. 12 people who didn't freeze. That was enough. People began to come by during daylight hours. Contractors. Engineers. Old men who remembered the motel before it closed. Younger ones who'd never paid it any attention. They walked the perimeter. Took pictures. Asked careful questions. Caleb answered when he could. When he couldn't, he said so. One afternoon, a man in his 60s stood quietly near the door of the unnumbered room. He wore a faded jacket and gloves patched at the fingertips. I helped your father pour concrete once, he said. Caleb looked at him. He was different, the man continued. Didn't talk much. But he listened. Asked questions most folks didn't. He nodded toward the room. This feels like him. Caleb swallowed. Inside the room, The notebook filled with numbers. Temperature readings. Time intervals. Outside conditions. It wasn't guesswork anymore. It was proof. By the end of the week, the county placed a temporary designation on the room. Emergency shelter. Experimental classification. Limited occupancy. It came with warnings. Liability forms. Restrictions. Caleb signed them all. He didn't argue. He didn't need to. Because the room had already done what it was built to do. It had worked. And now it had consequences. Some good. Some heavy. And none of them were theoretical anymore. By the time spring loosened its grip on the hills, the Willow Creek Motel no longer felt abandoned. It still looked that way to anyone passing on the road. The sagging awning hadn't been fixed. The broken windows stayed boarded. The sign remained crooked. Caleb left it all untouched on purpose. What had changed wasn't the structure. It was the attention. People came quietly now. Not tourists. Not thrill seekers. They came in work trucks. County vehicles. Old sedans that smelled faintly of oil and coffee. They parked, walked the lot, and stopped at the unnumbered door. Some stayed only a few minutes. Others longer. No one tried to rent it. They didn't ask for keys. They asked how it worked. Caleb always started the same way. It's not about heat, he'd say. It's about refusing to lose it. That idea traveled farther than he expected. A university 2 counties over requested the measurements. An engineering firm asked permission to study the design. A nonprofit focused on rural housing cold weather resilience reached out with careful language and open-ended questions. Caleb didn't say yes to everything. He learned quickly that not every kind of attention was helpful. But he said yes to the ones that listened. The room was never copied exactly. It couldn't be. The land mattered. The slope. The soil. The decisions made inch by someone who understood this place better than anyone else. But the principles carried. Sealed envelopes. Earth temperature stability. Reduced volume. Passive systems that didn't fail when power did. By the following winter, 3 homes outside Redfern had been retrofitted using adapted versions of the design. Nothing flashy. Nothing expensive. Just careful changes. That winter was harsh too. No one froze. Caleb stayed at the motel through it all. He moved into a small trailer nearby, but he spent most of his days inside the building, documenting, maintaining, explaining. He stopped working construction full-time. Not because he didn't need the money, but because this felt like work that mattered in a different way. He found his father's old toolbox behind the front desk one afternoon. The latch was stiff. Inside were the things you'd expect. Wrenches. Tape. A level worn smooth from use. At the bottom was a folded piece of paper. Not a letter. A sketch. It showed the room in cross-section. Walls shaded thick. The underground pipe drawn in pencil. Measurements scribbled in the margins. And at the bottom, in his father's careful handwriting, a single line. For when the cold gets worse. Caleb sat on the floor and held the paper for a long time. He understood then that the room wasn't built for secrecy. It was built for patience. His father hadn't been hiding from the world. He'd been waiting for it to catch up. The motel never reopened. It wasn't turned into a museum or a center or anything that required signage and tickets. The county eventually stabilized the structure enough to keep it safe. The rest was left alone. The unnumbered door stayed unlocked. Inside, the room remained exactly as it had been. The notebook now resting open on the desk, filled with dates and numbers and names. People signed it sometimes. Not for credit. For record. On the anniversary of the storm, Caleb stood alone in the room just before dusk. The air was calm. The hills were green again. Birds moved through the trees without urgency. The room felt the same as it always had. Balanced. He thought about how close he'd come to selling the place without ever stepping inside. How easily the room could have been demolished, its logic lost under rubble and paperwork. He thought about how often that happened. Good ideas buried because they didn't fit. Quiet solutions ignored because they didn't announce themselves. Caleb closed the notebook and set it back on the desk. He didn't add a plaque. He didn't name the room. He didn't need to. The lesson didn't belong to him. It belonged to anyone willing to pay attention. That winter, when the power went out again in Redfern, people didn't panic the way they used to. They checked on each other. They sealed drafts. They remembered what worked. And when someone asked Caleb why he stayed, why he hadn't taken the money and left, he always gave the same answer. Because survival doesn't have to be loud, he said. And because sometimes the smartest thing you can inherit is a responsibility. On the last day of the year, Caleb stood in the doorway of the unnumbered room and looked out at the hills. The door stayed open, not as an invitation, as a reminder that when the cold comes, what matters most isn't how much you have. It's what you're willing to understand. Optional disclaimer. This story is inspired by real historical passive heating techniques. Characters and events are fictionalized for storytelling purposes.